Okay, we're going to finally talk about this. I know that I got a lot of requests on this when this certainly came out. Main reason being is because a lot of you came to this channel by way of my coverage of this whole, Modelo virus stuff that happened in 2020. I was on top of it. This was one of my leading topics. Definitely as it pertains to liberty and how it impacted this country and the rest of the world. Yes, I was ahead of it. This is not you're bragging about being right. It's more so pointing out the fact that governments around the world just flat out lied to you, and anybody should have been able to see it coming. But propaganda is real, and it really shows how if you strike fear within a populace, what kind of crazy things you can make happen. New Twitter files dropped yesterday, the day before I shot this. And it talks about how the debate around this topic was rigged by way of governments being involved. We're going to go through all of it right now. So this will be just like the previous Twitter files. This will be something that is maybe going to take some time. So let's go through it. Let's just get right into it. It's coming from David Zweig. If I butchered your name, my apologies. The Twitter files, how Twitter rigged the COVID debate. By censoring, and this is, I guess these are the main points, by censoring info that was true but inconvenient to U.S. government policy, by discrediting doctors and other experts who disagreed, by suppressing ordinary users, including some sharing the CDC's own data. So far, the Twitter files have focused on evidence of Twitter's secret blacklist, which we've covered that, how the company functioned as a kind of subsidiary of the FBI. That was such a big thing, and it still seems that folks are just kind of putting it by the wayside when you find out that not only that they were just working with the FBI, but in cases that we know it applied to other forms of social media as well, the FBI were paying to have their sort of imprint on what narratives were allowed to exist and spread on social media. It's a far more serious story than I think people are making it out to be. And how execs rewrote the platform's rules to accommodate their own political desires, leaning heavy leftism. What we have yet to cover is COVID. This reporting for the Free Press is one piece of that important story. The United States government pressured Twitter. Okay, we know that. Pressured Twitter and other social media platforms to elevate certain content and to suppress other content about COVID-19. Now, I already knew that. I certainly already knew that. We've covered the different policy changes. Some, like with YouTube, were very, very blatant with how they were doing it. And they deemed it as like the spread of misinformation, medical misinformation, disinformation. So we've already seen it flat out admitted. But with certain other ones, they wanted to make it appear as if, well, one of two things. They were trying to save people in doing so, or just flat out ignore the fact that this was happening as if they weren't doing it at all. Internal files at Twitter that I viewed while on assignment showed that both the Trump and Biden administrations directly pressed Twitter executives to moderate the platform's pandemic content according to their wishes. I know some of y'all get upset because some of y'all are Trump supporters. I've long told you that he's been in on this, okay? And this is one of those things where you get some of these weirdos start acting like leftists because it's like, well, they don't want to accept something that muddies up their, let's say, sensibilities, right? They have this way that the world has to be, and that can't be crushed. So they would justify it if anything else. I've told y'all, you cannot be upset at the landscape of this whole jab, push, and all that. You can't be upset without putting some type of blame from the guy who kicked a lot of it off with Operation Warp Speed, and that's Donald Trump. And this is why, even to this day, he still, sometimes he gets booed for it, but he will still try to take credit for this because he deems it as something that was on him. So you can't be like, well, this thing got rushed out, yada, yada, executive authorization, all that. You can't say all that without putting some blame on Trump and his establishment, or rather his administration. So they pressed Twitter. I already read that. All right, so moving on. At the onset of the pandemic, according to meeting notes, the Trump admin was especially concerned about panic buying. They came looking for help from the tech companies to combat misinformation about runs on grocery stores. But there were runs on grocery stores. So this is what we have here looking at these files. The Trump White House, specifically Michael Kratsios, led the Trump administration's calls for help from the tech companies to combat misinformation. This is very damning evidence here. Areas to focus including the conspiracies around 5G cell towers, runs on grocery stores, and misinformation that could stoke panic buying and behaviors coverage here. So that's going to be, I guess, the way that people try to salvage is like, well, it's more economic than anything. They're trying to stop people from panic buying certain things, maybe at the grocery stores, yada, yada. So we needed them to crack down on certain messaging. Number 7, it wasn't just Twitter. The meetings with the Trump White House were also attended by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and others. I've long known this. Twitter, alongside several other tech companies, including Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, participated. Activities included a standing weekly call to share general trends, hosting, a shared Microsoft Teams group. Some of the companies, not Twitter, gathered open source information from researchers. Our teams fed this information to the Twitter policy enforcement teams. So meetings between the government and the biggest tech platforms. When the Biden admin took over, one of their first meeting requests with Twitter executives was on COVID. The focus was on anti-vaxxer accounts, especially Alex Berenson. Now, we know he took off. I think we covered that. He was one of the guys kind of really leading the charge. He said some other weird stuff, neither here nor there. But he was one of the guys leading the charge and then really exposing a lot of this information in his reporting. One of the first meeting requests from the Biden White House was COVID misinformation per regular process. Public policy took the meeting. Biden staff focused on vaccines and high-profile anti-vaxxers account like Alex Berenson. In the summer of 2021, Biden said social media companies were killing people for allowing vaccine misinformation. Berenson was suspended hours after Biden's comments and kicked off the platform the following month. Berenson sued and then settled with Twitter. We saw this. That's why he was actually let back on. In legal process, Twitter was compelled to release certain internal communications, which showed direct White House pressure on the company to take action on Berenson. And so that was an actual thing. Overall, pretty good. They had one tough question about why Alex Berenson had been kicked off from the platform. Otherwise, their questions were pointed but fair and merciful. We had answers. So they were being pushed. The government was actively pushing. And we know that this happened in other aspects, but with COVID, they were actively pushing people, or pushing Twitter, probably other companies, but Twitter, to get a singular person off because they focused on a specific type of information that they will put out there that may have went against their narrative. A December 22 summary of meetings with the White House by Lauren Culbertson, Twitter's head of U.S. public policy, adds new evidence of the White House's pressure campaign and cements that it repeatedly attempted to directly influence the platform. Culbertson wrote that the Biden team was very angry that Twitter had not been more aggressive in deplatforming multiple accounts. They wanted Twitter to do more, and that's documented right here. The Biden team was not satisfied. It says it all right here. It says they were very angry in nature. Twitter executives did not fully I always have trouble with today. Capitulate to the Biden team's wishes. An extensive review of internal communications at the company revealed employees often debating moderation cases in great detail and with more care than was shown by the government towards free speech. But Twitter did suppress views, many from doctors and scientific experts that conflicted with the official positions at the White House or of the White House. As a result, legitimate findings and questions that would have expanded the public debate went missing. There were serious problems with Twitter's process. First, much of the content moderation was conducted by bots trained on a machine learning AI, impressive in their engineering, yet still too crude for such nuanced work. Second, contractors in places like the Philippines also moderated content. They were given decision trees to aid the process, but tasking non-experts to adjudicate tweets on complex topics like myocarditis, mask efficiency, and data was just destined for a significant error rate. And here's one of the, it looks like, let me see this. Okay, so I don't know if that's like their bot right there or what. Third, most importantly, the buck stopped with higher level employees at Twitter who chose the inputs for the bots. All right, so that's what it was, for the bots and decision trees, and subjectively decided escalated cases and suspensions. As it is with people and institutions, there was individual and collective bias. With COVID, this bias went heavily towards establishment dogmas. Inevitably, dissident yet legitimate content was labeled as misinformation. We knew that stuff that was absolutely true got labeled as misinformation. And the accounts of doctors and others were suspended both for tweeting opinions and demonstrably true information. Exhibit A, and I've covered Martin Kulldorff, an epidemiologist at Harvard Medical School, tweeted views at odds with the U.S. public authorities and the American left. The political affiliation of nearly the entire staff at Twitter, we've already covered that. That was a thing. That's not an opinion. The staff of Twitter they were heavily to the left, almost exclusively. Martin Kulldorff was ahead of a lot of this stuff, and this is his own expertise. He has just as much credentials, actually better in a lot of cases, than the people that are making these decisions, not only for the government, but deciding what information should be allowed to spread, what's misinformation versus what's the acceptable narrative. Internal emails show an intent of action by a moderator saying Kulldorff's tweet violated the company's COVID-19 misinformation policy and claimed false information. So you see this right here. In internal emails, they have the tweet says sending a heads up that we will take action. It was an inside job. But Kulldorff's statement was an expert's opinion, one which also happened to be in line with vaccine policies in numerous other countries, yet it was deemed false information by Twitter moderators merely because it differed from the CDC's guideline. After Twitter took action, Kulldorff's tweet was slapped with misleading label, and all replies and likes were shut off, throttling tweets' ability to be seen. We did see this in action where certain things were just not allowed to spread at all. It was it was an inorganic process where they would say, well, you can't even view this in some cases, or you had to go extra steps in order to view it because they didn't want this to be spreading around. In my review of the internal files, I find countless instances of tweets being labeled as misleading or taken down entirely, sometimes triggering account suspensions simply because they veered from the CDC guidance or differed from the establishment. A tweet by this person, a self-proclaimed public health fact checker with 18,000 followers, was flagged for misleading and replies and likes disabled, even though it displayed the CDC's own data. I've done this before as well. I would cover. I was like, hey, man, don't take my word for any, even going by the data of your own, the people that you say we must listen to. It doesn't make sense with the policies. Internal records show that a bot had flagged the tweet and that it received many tattles, which is what amusingly called reports from users that triggered a manual review by a human who, despite the tweet actually showing CDC data, nevertheless, they labeled it misleading. It goes against the current narrative. It's from the CDC, who you say are the people that we can't differ from. The experts that we specifically cannot differ from, you show their own data, but because it shows a different picture, different landscape of what you're trying to perpetuate, well, now it's a problem. And therefore, we're going to label you as misleading. COVID has never been the leading cause of death from disease in children, yet the tweet remains on the platform and without a misleading label. Whether by humans or algorithms, content that was a contrarian but true which is an important thing to note, was still subject to getting flagged or suppressed. This tweet is labeled misleading, even though the owner of the account, a physician, so a person that is practicing in this field, was referring to the result of a published study. I've done this before as well. You share something that is factually correct, or let's say it comes from the experts that they told us to listen to, but it's not the doom and gloom. It's not jabs or nothing. It's not showing that as a conclusion. Experts chimed in on it. They said it. So he's going on with more and more examples. Andrew Boston, Rhode Island physician, was permanently suspended, from Twitter after receiving multiple strikes for misinformation. One of his strikes for a tweet referring to the results from a peer-reviewed study on mRNA vaccines. A review of Twitter log files revealed that an internal audit conducted after Boston's attorney contacted Twitter found that only one of Boston's 5 violations were even valid. Still suspended him or whatever. The Boston tweet found to still be in violation cited data that was legitimate but inconvenient to the public health establishment's narrative about flu versus COVID in children. This tweet was not flagged by a bot, not only flagged by a bot, but its violation manually was affirmed by a staff member, is telling both algorithmic and human bias at play, which is true, which is what we have to mention there, is that even upon the manual review, it's not just the bots. Both ways, it was rigged against the people that would tell the truth, but it was an inconvenient thing, and they were internally suppressed. In a surreal exchange, Jim Baker, at the time Twitter's deputy general counsel, asked why telling people to not be afraid was a violation of Twitter's COVID-19 policy. Yoel Roth, Twitter's former head of trust and safety, had to explain that optimism wasn't misinformation. So wait a minute. So he says, why this POTUS tweet a violation of our COVID policy? Why isn't? So Jim Baker was actually asking, and both of these are in on it. Yoel Roth, even though he's saying, well, optimism isn't isn't against the policy that we have, he's still, as covered in the other Twitter files, was in on a lot of this stuff pertaining to the FBI and all this as well. And even he's like, oh, well, that's a little much. Remember that CDC data tweet? Twitter's response to her is clarifying, we will prioritize and review and labeling of content that could lead to increased exposure of transmission. Twitter made a decision via the political leanings of the senior staff and government pressure that the public health authorities' approach to the pandemic, prioritizing mitigation over other concerns, was the science. Information that challenged that view, such as showing harms of vaccines or that could be perceived as downplaying the risk of COVID, especially to children, was subject to moderation and even suppression. What might this pandemic and its aftermath have looked like if had more people, or if there had been more of an open debate on Twitter and other social media platforms, not to mention the mainstream press, about the origins of COVID, about lockdowns, the true risk in COVID in kids, and much, much more. And that was the case that I had made the entire time. It's that the tech companies and the role that they played was insane in some cases, where you had to talk around. You remember those 2 doctors that would talk about these, it was Dr. Erickson, I think, out of California. And he came out and he was talking about, people going around, I think children in particular. Of course, it was a narrative that was antithetical to what the experts said, and they didn't even give me a strike. YouTube just took the video down and said that it couldn't be played, which tells you right then and there, it's like, well, we can't really find that you violated something, but we don't want this thing spreading. Usually they would strike you. I didn't even get a strike for that. Though I had got strikes. I was the back-to-back YouTube strike champ. Actually, back-to-back if I'm not mistaken. Where there were videos, one of them I remember at least in terms of my strikes, were me going through data specifically that was coming from, because with YouTube's information, it was the WHO you couldn't go against. And I was showing specific information that did not conflict with that. And some of it came directly from them. Like that Johnny Anitas study was straight from the WHO. It was a bulletin on their website. And I got struck for it because of probably both algorithms. And then when it comes to the manual review, I show the receipts and they're like, okay, yeah, we can't really get them on this. Okay, lift it. Twitter was up to the same nonsense, but worse. You didn't allow the free flowing of the information. It is not, and it should not be, a platform, especially government's idea or job to try to protect people, number one, for themselves, but number two, you can't just have one side and act like it's conclusive. That's not what science is. Science, or what people have generally seen as the consensus, has been incorrect over the course of human history. And the fact that there were experts that had the same amount of expertise that were ringing the alarm on this, but because they were saying something that went against maybe what the government was saying and trying to perpetuate, is insane. You wouldn't allow them to speak, even though they were an expert. You told us to listen to them, but they said something different. And they didn't allow that. It was that side is wrong, that side is dangerous, and we cannot allow that to spread. Getting all these people hyped up on something that had a 99% survival rate. Businesses getting shut down, all of that nonsense. We find out with the jab, the whole emergency authorization was a sham. And that it was authorized because of the spread of transmission. Coming to find out that had nothing to do with the jab. Stopping the mitigating the transmission. Wasn't even something that they tested for. And then even so, it didn't take long for that to not be the case. Dr. Rochelle Walensky of the CDC even admitted that. We know that it doesn't stop transmission anymore. And then even just repeating what she said, you still have people going on with the lies because it was allowed to manifest for so long. It ain't that the lies were allowed to spread. That's not even the issue. The issue is that those that were calling it for what it was, they were seen as the enemies. So you did what you could, government including, working with tech companies, which is that's what fascism is, by the way. Working with the private institutions, using that term loosely, because it's not private at that point. Once you get government influence, that's not what you can't fall back on that. But you were working with them to suppress information. And because of the slant of the people at the platform, which has to be you have to set that up for anything coming out as it gets more and more gets uncovered. Almost exclusively, there was one political ideology that dominated Twitter internally. And that, of course, had a lot to do with the bias and approach. A lot of y'all were sold on a lie, but it wasn't simply that. It's that those of us that were ringing along, experts and people that just looked at the data for what it was, were actively being suppressed. And that allowed it to manifest because you didn't allow for the competition. You didn't allow for us to combat it. Instead, you just said, shut up and punish the people that were just ringing an alarm on the truth. Wherever you're viewing the content, I appreciate you. If you enjoyed it, you may be interested in my comic book company, Rippaverse Comics.
Our first book and campaign, ISOM #1, brought in $3.7 million with tens of thousands of satisfied customers. Visit Rippaverse.com to check out our store and stay up to date with the latest campaigns from one of the hottest new comic book companies. Also, my first big step towards a parallel economy was the development of my personal website, ericdjuly.com. This entirely replaced my Patreon. Now, if you enjoy this content, please consider becoming a member over at the website. We have an ever-expanding list of perks for various membership tiers, a forum, and a phone app. Some of these perks will even benefit you if you're fans of the Rippaverse. Anyway, I appreciate you so much for being a supporter and or customer. I even got a little love for my haters.